Does one find the transpersonal at the feet of an altar? Or perhaps does one find it at the side of a river with its endless flow of life-giving water? Maybe we find it in the yearly migrational patterns of the geese, again and again finding their way to each other and to home. Perhaps we find the transpersonal at that most sacred of edges between life and death. Do we find the transpersonal in the face of our beloved pets? In both the beginning and end of their amazing lives? And is it beyond the personal when we love them even when they're being naughty? Do we find the transpersonal in the 100 ways we have to alter our consciousness? Is the transpersonal held in the beauty and mystery of the artist? Do we find it in the flowers and plants that bring us so much life and joy? Or might the transpersonal lay at the other end of the spectrum, outside of the place where we think we're done with something? We think it's gone away, and we come to realize there actually is no away. Do we find the transpersonal in a derelict building, repurposed by amazing hands into something that's a work of art, that's a work of wonder, that's a work of inspiration to anybody who happens to be walking by? And is the transpersonal found simply in nature? Does access to the transpersonal require work and service? Does it require that we deeply study the sacred and the sacred geometries of our world? Does it that we walk a particular path in order to access the transpersonal? And is the transpersonal always just part of us? And if we just turn and look to the side of whatever path we happen to be on, we'll find it.
त्र्यम्बकं यजामहे सुगन्धिं पुष्टिवर्धनम् उर्वारुकमिव बन्धनम्।
And might it be asking us at any given moment of our lives, come, have a seat at the table. We'll feed you. So what's the path we've walked to get here at this question about transpersonal counseling and transpersonal approaches? Let's dig in some. So we're going to start back in the 16th century. A Lutheran reformer by the name of Philip Melanchthon decided to interiorize the psyche. So he may be the first person to have used the word psychology, but he decided that the psyche was internal to us, disconnected from outside of us. Second thing, also around that same time, was the beginning of the scientific revolution. And the element of the scientific revolution that I'd like to highlight here is that things can be absolutely known. That if you reduce everything to its component parts, you can understand everything about that thing or that phenomenon. So if you interiorize the psyche, and you have an attitude that everything can be completely and absolutely known, mechanistic, reductionistic, in an absolutist or reductionistic, mechanistic way, then you have a setup to extract psychology, extract our psyche, extract our experience to that of the very interior, to that of measurable, knowable, linear method of looking at it. And I'm just going to go ahead and make an assumption here that that more or less limited view is not what has attracted us to a transpersonal program. So at its core, transpersonal psychology, what you usually hear is that it's the integration of spiritual and psychological dimensions. That there's a focus on self-transcendence and expanded states of consciousness. That the mere interiority that I mentioned a moment ago does not have the sufficient depth of relationship that includes the actual human reality. John Muir said about the interrelatedness of all things, that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And as a transpersonal counselor, transpersonal psychologist, absolutely positively we believe that to be completely true. And in a way where it's not just some sort of floaty idea, that it is actually deeply rooted in very tangible and relatable aspects of existence. That really, if we are existing in an animate way on this earth and with each other, then a transpersonal counseling and psychology makes all the sense in the world. That it is more holistic. It includes all aspects of well-being. It addresses the existential, the spiritual, and all meaning-centered concerns. It includes non-ordinary states of consciousness, some examples of which would be deep meditation, psychedelic states, yoga, physical exertion, ecstatic dance, group meditation, breath work. All of these help us expand beyond the mere interior, the mere experience of a psychology housed solely within our singular experience. If you'd like to geek out on some of the neurology behind these non-ordinary states of consciousness, some of the interactions with the following excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, hormonal systems, and brain networks are implicated in these non-ordinary states, such as serotonin, which enhances connectivity between brain regions that are typically not otherwise connected to that same extent, which is also associated with types of ego dissolution that happens in some non-ordinary states of consciousness. There's dopamine, which is associated with pleasure, euphoria, effortlessness, and time dilations, we find. Glutamate, which is involved in the breakdown of normal reality constructs, especially in the thalamus and also the prefrontal cortex. There's also GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is associated with relaxation, also detachment from the ego, and some reduction in the default mode network. Also endogenous opioids give us feelings of bliss, some relief, and you could think of things like a runner's high with a physical exertion we mentioned above. There's also oxytocin, which gives us a sense of unity and increased empathy. Norepinephrine gives us heightened awareness. Also endocannabinoids give us a sense of peace, also some altered time perceptions. Our default mode network gets deactivated or less active, so there's lessening of ego with that. There's a lessening of ego boundaries and an emergence of some novelty. Also increases in neuroplasticity, so the making of new neural connections. And if you pair that with the serotonin increasing connectivity in different brain regions and the neuroplasticity of making new neural connections, then some of those new connectivity can actually be more enduring. And then lastly is brain-derived neurotropic factor. That can also lead to long-term cognitive and emotional changes. So with the neuroplasticity and serotonin I just mentioned, that BDNF actually can help make some changes that occur in non-ordinary states be more enduring. Let's talk a little bit about historical foundations of transpersonal psychology. Precursors, influences include Eastern philosophies, for example, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, also mystical traditions and indigenous wisdom. And then more in the Western end of the equation, a lot started in the 1800s with William James, one of the founding folks in the field of psychology, Carl Jung, Anthony Sutich, Abraham Maslow, Stanislav Grof, Stanley Krippner, Ken Wilber, Michael Washburn, Christina Grof, and many, many others. Some of the ways these folks have contributed to the field include through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Jung's collective unconscious as a concept. We used to have a course at Naropa called Holotropic Breathwork, and that was based on Stan Grof's work and really helped folks participating get into very altered states of consciousness. He also used his basic perinatal matrices is part of that work. You can explore that as you want. There's also been an alignment with humanistic psychology in the transpersonal realm. You think about or remember the 4 forces of psychology, starting with psychoanalytic, then behavioral, then, and for a while the 4th force was transpersonal, although that never, I don't know if that's fully lasted. There have been other proposals for what the 4th force of psychology is and or has been. And there are ongoing criticisms and misconceptions about transpersonal approaches. One of the challenges is in integrating spirituality with psychological practices. Also, another challenge is in addressing cultural appropriations as an ethical concern. Some of the criticisms and critiques of transpersonal approaches that I have seen are that it's unscientific, even labeled as anti-scientific. I've seen it labeled as asocial, authoritarian, absolutist, dogmatic, dangerous, psychologically unsound, unable to adequately define itself, and actually unable to adequately define its methodology. And I believe some of those are fair critiques and just important for us to know that they are out there. Some theoretical frameworks that are out there that are important for us to know. I would say when we regard states and stages of consciousness, the premier model would be Ken Wilber's integral model. Tons out there. If you're not familiar, it's very, very worthwhile to dig into Ken Wilber's work. Stan Grof's perinatal matrices that I mentioned before are also some stage work that does exist. There's also the self-transcendence and ego transcendence frameworks, where these pathways to transcending the self exist. And there are multiple practices that foster transcendence: meditation, mindfulness, psychedelics, ecstatic experiences that fit for me in the non-ordinary states of consciousness category. And so some of the other ways, methods, the breath work, I'd say some religious experiences foster these non-ordinary states. As I said, meditation, dreams, our dream states, dream analysis. Runner's high fits here. Music can fit. Drumming, chanting, unity experiences of all sorts that often people have in nature. Drug experiences. And I'm going to list that separately than psychedelics. Near-death experiences, I think float tanks, sensory deprivation tanks, sexual experiences of union can also be attempts at non-ordinary states of consciousness. And basically any peak experiences that do foster self-transcendence. And then lastly, in the models just want to talk a little bit about multi-dimensional nature of self. That is not merely a self-transcendence, just other dimensions of self. These can include physical, emotional, mental, spiritual dimensions. And I think a lot of what I listed above, breathwork, religious experiences, meditation, mindfulness, dreams, guided imagery also fits in multidimensional parts of self, art therapy, journaling, any integration of spiritual practices, any emphasis on self-actualization, Jungian psychology fits here, existential approaches fit here. People, while protesting, you're in a group field effect at a protest, any group activity. You go to a sports game and you feel other aspects of self that come out. Flow states, tarot reading, hearing a beautiful voice, birth, death, childbirth. All of these are multidimensional natures of self that tend to have us love, look, and feel differently with ourselves in those moments. Let's talk a little about some of the applications in counseling. So what are the goals of transpersonal? So what are the goals to go beyond the personal? From Buddhism, there is the concept of self as an illusion, that it is our ego states, our flawed ego states. It is a benefit to transcend that. I agree. And one of my favorite concepts from transpersonal is that of transcend and include. Meaning, while we can transcend ego states, we can transcend our id, as Freud says. We transcend, and we must include those other states. So if we transcend our ego, we still have an ego. And so I think excellent transpersonal work includes. So yes, while we can have peak moments, we can have non-ordinary states of consciousness, we do have ordinary states of consciousness. They do actually exist. So I think a lot of folks can run into some issues if they try to go beyond without including. Other techniques and practices that are used, mentioned a bunch before. I'll mention again guided visualizations, meditation, breath work, dream work, active imagination, and the certainly emerging psychedelic assisted field. One other piece when talking about applications in counseling are with spiritual emergencies. For further reading, I really recommend Christina Groff's work. And so spiritual emergencies, I also like that word because our common use of the word emergency is like, oh, hey, red light flashing, there's an emergency. So if I'm having a spiritual emergency, a transpersonal person would be great to work with. And it also could be seen as an emergence. So spiritual emergence. So working with both the crisis, managing a spiritual crisis, identifying and managing a spiritual crisis, providing a safe, non-pathologizing space, and also having the therapeutic context that is transpersonal, which does foster the emergence of one's spiritual aspects. And lastly, in the applications part, I want to talk about or mention addressing diverse client needs. That it is incumbent upon us to integrate cultural and religious perspectives that are different than ours. And that we should be tailoring our interventions to the client's worldviews. Now that's neither of those are inherently transpersonal. Just a reminder that I think especially in the transpersonal realm, we really do have to have a heightened cultural sensitivity toward our clients. And the last piece I'd like to talk about are just some ethical considerations and reminders. First, our boundaries and our competence as we navigate spiritual versus psychological roles that really need to be aware of our ability to do so, our competence in doing so, our cross-cultural competence in doing so, and our really very, very, very clear and crisp sense of our boundaries. What is our professional training? What is our personal training? What is our level of self-awareness of these states? Especially if we're working in non-ordinary states of consciousness, boundaries by definition are blurred, so as clinicians, we need to be hyper aware of appropriate boundaries in this boundaryless space. And another piece that I put into the boundaries and competence section is the pre-trans fallacy. And I first came across that in Ken Wilber's work, where he talks about confusing a transpersonal state with a pre-personal experience. So if somebody is merely having a drug experience, I mentioned drug experience before, it might be easy to mistake that for a transpersonal experience, that somebody is actually just numbing out pain. That is actually more of a pre-personal or personal level activity rather than a transpersonal activity. So keeping in mind that we don't conflate something that's actually pre-personal with a more transpersonal experience or emergency, if you will. Cultural sensitivity is another ethical consideration. Mentioned this a couple of times before. Want to really avoid any cultural appropriation. Are you appropriately trained? Are you appropriately invited into any spiritual traditions or any other traditions before we're allowed or able to speak from that perspective? And then also that we really want to make sure we're respecting our client's spiritual and belief systems. Another consideration is the need for additional research and increased evidence-based practices in this field, that we need to continue to evaluate the efficacy of any transpersonal methods. And also to be aware that that evidence-based support is not fully out there. We also, I think, need to keep in mind the contributions that we can and hopefully will make to the broader field of psychology. Now this, I think, comes full circle to where we started when talking about how with the scientific reformation and psychology went interior, that's not actually the human state. Transpersonal psychology, you could look at that as the oldest of all forms of psychology because that's been around as long as human beings. And so we managed to find a way to get away from our true nature. So I do believe a transpersonal approach actually returns us to our true and fuller nature as human beings. So we are going from an interiorized psyche, the traditional psychology, to a more interrelated, integrated, exterior and interior relation of soul, psyche, and spirit. And with that, I want to close out this short introduction to transpersonal approaches. Thank you for your kind attention and look forward to more connection.